Tonight, we're winding down with a calm collection of boring but fascinating Pokemon facts, one creature at a time. So get comfortable, let your mind drift, and let these quiet little details carry you gently into sleep. There's something quietly fascinating about Ninetales, because even though it looks like a graceful, almost mystical fox, most of what makes it interesting in Pokemon is how long it has stayed consistent as a concept across generations. Ninetales is a fire-type Pokemon introduced in Generation 1, and it evolves from Vulpix using a Firestone, making it one of the earliest examples of a stone evolution line in the series. That simple evolution method has stayed the same for decades, and it's one of the reasons Ninetales feels so classic, because it belongs to a time when Pokemon evolution was often straightforward, fast, and tied to a single important item. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, Ninetales was one of the version-exclusive Pokemon lines. Vulpix and Ninetales were only available in Pokemon Blue, while Pokemon Red players got Growlithe and Arcanine instead. That detail alone made Ninetales feel a little more special to some players, because in the earliest days of Pokemon, version exclusives were a major reason trading mattered. If you wanted a Ninetales in Pokemon Red, you had to trade for it, which made the Pokemon feel rarer, even though it wasn't technically a legendary or anything close. Ninetales' design is heavily inspired by the Kitsune, a fox spirit from Japanese folklore that is often depicted as intelligent, magical, and sometimes mischievous. Kitsune are commonly associated with multiple tails, and in many stories, a Kitsune grows additional tails as it becomes older and more powerful. Ninetales fits that idea perfectly, since it is a fox Pokemon with 9 tails, and its entire concept is built around the idea of age, mystery, and supernatural ability. Even though Pokemon doesn't always directly explain folklore influences in-game, Ninetales is one of those designs where the inspiration is so clear that it feels intentional from the start. The Ninetales themselves are one of the most recognizable parts of Ninetales' silhouette. In most official artwork, the tails are large, flowing, and almost cloud-like, and they give the Pokemon a sense of elegance. In battle sprites, especially in older games, the tails were sometimes simplified due to hardware limitations, but the general idea has always been maintained. Ninetales looks like a creature that moves smoothly and calmly, which is fitting for a Pokemon that is often described as being very intelligent and capable of using mystical powers. In terms of Pokédex lore, Ninetales has consistently been portrayed as a Pokemon that is extremely long-lived and capable of living for 1,000 years. This is one of those classic Pokemon exaggerations, but it fits the folklore theme perfectly. Many entries also emphasize that Ninetales is intelligent and that it can understand human speech. It's sometimes described as being able to curse people who mistreat it, which gives it a reputation as a Pokemon that should be respected and not taken lightly. The curse theme is one of the more consistent details in Ninetales' Pokédex entries. In multiple games, it's said that if someone grabs one of Ninetales' tails, they could be cursed for 1,000 years. That number, 1,000, shows up repeatedly, reinforcing the idea that Ninetales is connected to long spans of time. It's not just a fox that happens to have 9 tails. It's a fox that represents age, consequence, and ancient power, at least in the mythic sense that Pokemon likes to use. Even though Ninetales is a fire type, its lore doesn't focus much on typical fire-type themes like lava, volcanoes, or extreme heat. Instead, it focuses more on spiritual mystery, curses, and supernatural intelligence. That makes it stand out compared to many other early fire types. It's a fire Pokemon, but it feels like it could have easily been a ghost type or Psychic type if the series had wanted to lean harder into the mystical side. In a way, Ninetales is an early example of a Pokémon whose theme goes beyond its typing. In the original Generation 1 games, Ninetales' battle roll was a bit unusual compared to other fire types. Its stats were not built around raw physical power. Instead, it had relatively good speed and special, which in Generation 1 was a single stat used for both special attack and special defense. This meant Ninetales could hit fairly hard with special fire moves, while also having decent special bulk. It wasn't the strongest fire-type attacker available, but it was fast and reliable, which gave it a useful niche. One important detail about Generation 1 is that fire-type moves were all considered special because the physical special split didn't exist yet. That split didn't arrive until Generation 4. So in early Pokémon games, Ninetales benefited from having decent special because its fire-type attacks were using that stat. This helped it function as a fast special attacker, even if its overall move pool was somewhat limited compared to what Pokémon can learn in later generations. Ninetales has often been associated with moves like Flamethrower, Fire Blast, and later, moves like Will-O-Wisp. Will-O-Wisp is a particularly fitting move for Ninetales because it burns the opponent, reducing their physical attack and dealing damage over time. It fits the idea of a mysterious fox that punishes enemies with lingering effects rather than brute force. Over time, Ninetales has often been used as a Pokémon that can support a team by spreading status conditions, not just by dealing damage. In terms of abilities, Ninetales has had a few important ones over the years. In generations where abilities exist, its standard ability has often been Flash Fire, which makes it immune to fire-type moves and boosts its fire-type attacks if hit by one. Flash Fire is a strong ability, and it gives Ninetales a way to switch into fire attacks safely, which can be useful in battles where predicting your opponent matters. It also reinforces the fire-type identity, even though the Pokémon's lore feels more mystical than fiery. Ninetales' hidden ability, introduced later, is Drought, which summons harsh sunlight when it enters battle. This ability dramatically changed how Ninetales could be used competitively because weather effects became a major strategic element in Pokémon battles. Drought boosts fire-type moves and weakens water-type moves, and it also enables certain other effects, like faster solar beam usage and certain ability interactions. For a long time, Ninetales was one of the main ways to set up Sun teams in competitive play, especially in formats where legendary Pokémon weren't allowed. That competitive role gave Ninetales a second life in the Pokémon community. In earlier generations, it was often considered a decent but not top-tier fire type. With Drought, it became strategically valuable, even if its stats weren't overwhelming. It didn't need to be the strongest attacker if its main job was to activate sunlight and support a team built around that weather condition. This is a good example of how abilities can redefine a Pokémon's identity in battle without changing its design. Ninetales also has an Alolan form, introduced in Generation 7 with Pokémon Sun and Moon. Alolan Ninetales is an Ice and Fairy type Pokémon, and it evolves from Alolan Vulpix using an Ice Stone. This form is a major reimagining of the original concept. Instead of being tied to fire and curses, Alolan Ninetales is portrayed as living on snowy mountains, elegant and pure looking, with pale fur and a more frosty aesthetic. It still has 9 tails, still has the graceful fox shape, but everything about it is shifted into a colder, more magical feeling. The Alolan form also has its own battle identity because it can have the ability Snow Warning, which summons hail when it enters battle. This makes it similar to how regular Ninetales can summon sun with Drought. In both cases, Ninetales becomes associated with weather manipulation, which is an interesting evolution of its identity over time. It started as a mystical fox with cursed lore, and it eventually became a Pokémon that can control environmental conditions in battle. The introduction of Alolan Ninetales also shows how Pokémon sometimes revisits older designs and gives them new life through regional forms. Ninetales was already popular, already iconic, but the Alolan form made it relevant again for a new generation of players. It also created a contrast that fans enjoyed. The original Ninetales as a warm, fiery fox spirit, and the Alolan version as a cold, elegant guardian of snowy peaks. In terms of habitat and availability, Ninetales is usually not encountered directly in the wild in most games. Instead, players find Vulpix and evolve it. This makes Ninetales feel like a reward Pokémon, something you earn through progression and item usage rather than something you just stumble into. Stone evolutions in Pokémon often work this way, and it creates a small sense of accomplishment when you finally evolve the Pokémon into its final form. One detail about stone evolutions is that in early generations, evolving too early could actually be a disadvantage because evolved Pokémon sometimes learned fewer moves by leveling up compared to their pre-evolved forms. Vulpix might learn certain moves earlier, while Ninetales might stop learning new moves naturally after evolution. This created an interesting decision for players. Evolve early for stronger stats, or wait longer to learn better moves first. Over time, Pokémon adjusted how stone evolution move learning works, but that early design quirk is part of why Ninetales has a quiet history in the way players approached it. Ninetales has also appeared across Pokémon media outside the main games. In the anime, it has been shown as a mysterious Pokémon with an almost legendary presence, especially in older episodes where it was treated with a kind of mystical respect. In various spin-off games, Ninetales often appears as a graceful, magical enemy or ally, fitting its folklore-inspired role. Even the name Ninetales is extremely direct and memorable. Some Pokémon names are abstract or based on puns, but Ninetales is exactly what it sounds like, a fox with 9 tails. That straightforward naming style was common in early Pokémon, and it's part of what makes Generation 1 Pokémon feel so iconic. The name is easy to remember, easy to understand, and instantly tied to the Pokémon's design. Ninetales type, Fire, is also part of why it has stayed popular. Fire types have always been popular with players because they often look cool, have strong offensive moves, and feel powerful. Even though Ninetales isn't the most aggressive fire type, it still benefits from that general appeal. It's a fire Pokémon that looks elegant instead of intimidating, which gives it a unique space in the fire type lineup. Over the years, Ninetales has also become a Pokémon that many players associate with beauty and style. It's often used in teams not because it's the strongest option, but because people like it. That's an important part of Pokémon culture. Not every team is built for maximum efficiency. Many teams are built around favorites, and Ninetales has been a favorite for a long time. In a broader sense, Ninetales represents one of Pokémon's earliest successes at blending mythology into creature design. It's not just an animal with an element, it's a concept, a folklore creature adapted into the Pokémon world. That design philosophy has become one of the series' greatest strengths. Pokémon can take inspiration from real-world myths, animals, objects, and ideas, and turn them into something that feels both familiar and original. Ninetales is one of the best early examples of that approach working perfectly. And even after all these years, even after hundreds of new Pokémon have been introduced, Ninetales still holds its place as one of the most recognizable and quietly iconic Pokémon from the first generation. It isn't the mascot, it isn't the strongest, it isn't a legendary, but it has remained relevant through its design, its lore, its battle roles, and its ability to evolve with the series through things like abilities and regional forms. It's a Pokémon that feels timeless in the way its Pokédex claims it is, a creature said to live for 1,000 years, still appearing in new games decades after its first introduction, still capturing attention with a simple silhouette of 9 flowing tails. And in the calm world of Pokémon facts, that consistency is one of the most interesting things about Ninetales of all. If there's one Pokémon that feels like it was designed to quietly exist in the background of Kanto without ever asking for attention, it's Venomoth. It isn't a legendary, it isn't a starter, and it isn't one of those Pokémon that gets constant spotlight in every generation. But Venomoth has been part of Pokémon since the very beginning, and it carries a surprisingly interesting mix of early series design choices, weird mechanics, history, and that classic Generation 1 vibe where certain Pokémon feel like they were made to simply fill out the ecosystem of the world. Venomoth is a bug and poison type Pokémon introduced in Generation 1. It evolves from Venonat starting at level 31, which makes it a fairly straightforward evolution line. You catch the fuzzy, wide-eyed Venonat, you train it up, and eventually it turns into Venomoth, a larger moth Pokémon with wings, compound eyes, and a more sleek, slightly eerie look. The evolution is simple, but it's also one of those examples where the Pokémon's concept becomes more obvious after evolving. Venonat looks like a strange bug creature. Venomoth looks like a moth. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, Venomoth fits into the early game's broader theme of bug-type Pokémon being common, accessible, and useful at first, but often falling off later. Bug types in Generation 1 were generally not the strongest overall category, partly because the move pools were limited and partly because the type matchups were not always favorable against later gym leaders and Elite Four members. Even so, Venomoth was one of the bug types that could remain useful longer than others, mostly because it had access to status moves and decent speed. One of the most interesting things about Venomoth is that it belongs to a very specific style of Pokémon design that was common in early generations. Real-world animal, but slightly strange. Venomoth isn't heavily stylized like later Pokémon designs that combine multiple themes. It's basically a moth, but with Pokémon proportions and a more intense face. It's the kind of Pokémon that makes the world feel like it has normal wildlife, except the wildlife can battle and learn psychic attacks. Venomoth's Pokédex entries tend to emphasize powder, poison, and nocturnal behavior. Across different games, it's often described as being active at night and attracted to light. That fits the behavior of many real moths, which are drawn to bright lights in the dark. The Pokémon version adds a more dangerous twist, describing Venomoth as scattering poisonous powder or releasing toxic dust from its wings. In some entries, that powder is described as being difficult to wash off, and in others, it's said to cause severe reactions if inhaled. The powder identity is important because it links Venomoth to a whole category of moves in Pokémon, like Poison Powder, Sleep Powder, and Stun Spore. Those moves are associated with plants and insects, and they are some of the most annoying and useful status moves in the series, depending on which side you're on. Venomoth is a Pokémon that can lean into that playstyle. Instead of just trying to deal damage quickly, it can slow battles down by putting opponents to sleep, poisoning them, or paralyzing them. That style of battling fits the idea of boring Pokémon facts perfectly, because Venomoth is not about flashy power, it's about quiet control. It's the kind of Pokemon that wins by being annoying in a calm, methodical way, not by doing huge damage numbers. In older games, especially, status conditions were extremely valuable because healing items were limited and battles could become slow and draining if your Pokemon were constantly asleep or poisoned. Venomoth's typing, Bug and Poison, is a very classic Generation 1 combination. In Kanto, Bug Poison shows up a lot because many early bug Pokemon also carried poison as a secondary type. Beedrill, Venomoth, and the Weedle line all fall into this category. It gives them extra weaknesses, but it also gives them access to poison-type moves and a slightly more threatening identity than pure bug types like Butterfree. In Generation 1 specifically, poison was one of the more common types, and it showed up on a lot of Pokemon that weren't even primarily poison creatures. The poison type was almost like a design shortcut, for this thing is kind of dangerous. Venomoth fits that idea well. A moth might not seem threatening, but once you add poison powder, suddenly it becomes something you wouldn't want flying around your face in the dark. Venomoth's stat spread has always been kind of balanced, but with a focus on speed and special attack in later generations. It's not a bulky Pokemon, and it's not a pure powerhouse either. It tends to be good enough in multiple areas without being extreme. That makes it the kind of Pokemon that can be used casually in a playthrough without feeling like dead weight. But it also rarely becomes the star of a competitive team unless it has a specific niche. One niche Venomoth has had over the years is access to Quiver Dance. Quiver Dance is one of the strongest setup moves in the game because it boosts special attack, special defense, and speed all at once. For a Pokemon like Venomoth, which already has decent speed, Quiver Dance can turn it into a legitimate threat if it gets the chance to set up. It's funny in a quiet way because Venomoth looks like something you'd ignore, but after one or two Quiver Dances, it can become much more dangerous than you'd expect. In the early generations, Venomoth didn't have Quiver Dance because the move didn't exist yet. Instead, its strength came from things like Sleep Powder and Psychic-type attacks. That brings up one of the most classic weird details about Generation 1. Venomoth can learn Psychic. This is one of those facts that feels strange until you remember that Generation 1 move pools were sometimes very loose. Many Pokemon could learn moves that didn't perfectly match their type or theme, especially through TMs. Psychic was one of the most overpowered types in Generation 1, and giving a Pokemon access to Psychic coverage could drastically improve its usefulness. Venomoth learning Psychic is also tied to the idea that insects and Pokemon are sometimes associated with strange mental abilities. In later generations, bug types get moves like Bug Buzz and have interactions with psychic types that feel more intentional. But in Generation 1, it was more like, this Pokemon is weird, so it can learn weird moves. Venomoth benefits from that old design style. Another small but important historical detail is that in Generation 1, bug-type moves were generally not very strong. The strongest common bug move was often Twineedle, which was exclusive to Beedrill, and Pin Missile, which had variable hits and inconsistent damage. Venomoth didn't have a strong bug-type attack that matched the power level of moves like Flamethrower or Thunderbolt. So even though it was a bug type, it often fought using poison and psychic moves instead. This is part of why bug types were seen as weaker in early Pokemon. The type itself wasn't always the problem. The move pool was. Over time, as Pokemon added stronger bug moves, bug types became more viable. Venomoth, as a bug type that lasted through all those generations, benefited from those improvements. Venomoth also has an interesting place in Pokemon's design history, because some fans have pointed out similarities between Venomoth and Butterfree and even suggested there may have been early design swaps or changes during development. This isn't something the games confirm, but it's a long-running curiosity in the Pokémon community. Both Pokémon have large wings, both are bug-like, and both have a kind of symmetrical design. It's one of those development rumor topics that people bring up occasionally when discussing how Generation 1 Pokémon were created. Even without those rumors, Venomoth is clearly part of that early bug ecosystem. In Kanto, bugs are common in forests and grassy routes, and Venomoth feels like a nighttime version of that ecosystem. Butterfree is the bright, daytime butterfly. Venomoth is the darker, poisonous moth. They complement each other in a way that makes the region feel more believable. In terms of where you actually find Venomoth in the games, it depends on the generation. In Pokémon Red and Blue, Venonat could be found in certain grassy areas, and Venomoth could sometimes be encountered later. In later games, Venonat often appears in forests, routes, or areas with tall grass. Venomoth is usually not a common encounter early because it's an evolved form. This means players who want Venomoth usually have to commit to training Venonat, which again gives Venomoth that earned feeling. Venomoth's shiny form is another small detail that longtime players sometimes enjoy. Shiny Venomoth has a noticeable color change compared to the normal version, and in many games, it looks brighter and more vibrant. Shiny hunting wasn't part of Generation 1, but as shinies became a major feature in later generations, Venomoth became one of those Pokémon that some players might hunt just because it's visually different enough to feel rewarding. In the anime, Venomoth has appeared occasionally, usually as a wild Pokémon or as part of a trainer's team. It's not one of the most featured Pokémon, but it fits naturally into the world whenever it shows up. A moth Pokémon that uses powders and flies at night makes perfect sense in the Pokémon universe. It doesn't need a special storyline, it just exists, and that's part of its charm. Venomoth's abilities have changed across generations as well. In modern games, it can have abilities like Shield Dust, which prevents additional effects from moves, or Tinted Lens, which makes not very effective moves deal more damage. Tinted Lens is especially interesting because it helps Venomoth hit harder even when it doesn't have perfect type matchups. It's an ability that makes a Pokémon more consistent, and consistency is often what separates a meh Pokémon from a useful one. Tinted Lens also fits Venomoth's identity in a subtle way. A moth's eyes and vision are a big part of its design, and Tinted Lens sounds like something related to vision. Pokémon abilities are often designed to connect to the Pokémon's theme, and this is one of those examples where the ability name feels like it belongs. Venomoth also has access to compound eyes in some generations, which increases the accuracy of moves. That ability is extremely useful when paired with moves like Sleep Powder, because Sleep Powder's accuracy is not perfect. With compound eyes, Venomoth becomes much more reliable at putting opponents to sleep, which can completely change how a battle goes. This again reinforces Venomoth's quiet strength. It isn't about raw damage, it's about control. Another detail about Venomoth is that it sits in an interesting place in the Pokédex numbering. Venonat is Hashforite, and Venomoth is number 49 inches, the national Pokédex, meaning they appear very early in the original list. That early placement makes them feel like part of the core foundation of Pokémon's world. They are not late-game surprises, they are basic wildlife Pokémon, but with enough personality to stand out. Venomoth's name is also simple and effective. It's basically Venom plus Moth. It tells you exactly what you need to know. It's a moth, and it's poisonous. Early Pokémon names were often like this, and it's part of why they're so memorable. You don't need a complicated explanation. The name gives you the concept immediately. In a playthrough of Pokémon Red, Blue, or later Kanto remakes, Venomoth is rarely the strongest Pokémon you can have, but it can be a useful one. It can help against certain types, with psychic coverage. It can put enemies to sleep, and it can wear them down with poison. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic, it's just quietly effective, which is exactly the kind of Pokémon that fits into a boring facts sleep video without being boring in a bad way. Venomoth is also a reminder of how much Pokémon has changed over time. In Generation 1, it was limited by weak bug moves and strange mechanics. In later generations, it gained stronger bug attacks, better abilities, and even powerful setup options like Quiver Dance. The Pokémon itself didn't change much visually, but the game systems around it changed a lot, and that allowed Venomoth to feel different in different eras. And that's kind of the quiet story of Venomoth overall. It's a Pokémon that has always been there, always flying around somewhere in the tall grass or forests, never demanding attention, but always ready to be part of a team if a player decides they like it. It's not a Pokémon that defines a generation, but it's a Pokémon that helps fill the world, making Kanto and beyond feel like real places where strange creatures live and thrive. So when you look at Venomoth, you're looking at one of Pokémon's oldest background residents, a moth with poison powder, compound eyes, and a surprisingly flexible battle history. Not legendary, not famous, just quietly present, generation after generation, like a little piece of the original Pokémon world that never left. Some Pokémon feel like they were created from a single simple joke, and then somehow became permanent parts of the series for decades, and Dugtrio is one of the best examples of that. It's basically 3 Diglett together, popping out of the ground like a strange little group project, and yet it has managed to stay relevant in the Pokédex, in competitive battles, and in Pokémon culture since Generation 1. Dugtrio is the evolved form of Diglett, and it has always been a ground-type Pokémon with one main job: be fast, hit hard, and disappear back into the earth before anyone can really deal with it. Dugtrio is a pure ground-type Pokémon introduced in the original Pokémon Red and Blue. It evolves from Diglett, starting at level 26, which is fairly early in a typical playthrough. Diglett is already known for being quick, but when it evolves into Dugtrio, that speed becomes even more noticeable. Dugtrio has traditionally been one of the fastest ground-type Pokémon available in the games, and that speed is one of the main reasons people have used it over the years. Design-wise, Dugtrio is extremely straightforward. It's 3 brown mole-like heads coming out of the ground. It has small oval eyes, simple noses, and in many versions of the artwork, it looks almost blank and expressionless. In later generations, Dugtrio's faces sometimes look a little more defined, but it still keeps that simple look. The simplicity is part of what makes it memorable. Pokémon designs can get very complex, but Dugtrio is almost aggressively minimal. 3 heads, 1 body you never see. That's the entire concept. And because you never see the body, Dugtrio becomes one of those Pokémon that creates questions without ever answering them. What does it look like under the ground? How deep does it go? Is it actually 3 separate Diglett living together, or one creature with 3 heads? Pokémon never gives a definitive answer, and that mystery has become part of the Dugtrio experience. It's funny because the design looks like a joke, but the unanswered questions make it weirdly interesting. Pokédex entries for Dugtrio often focus on how it digs. It's described as being able to tunnel through the earth at high speeds, leaving behind perfectly tilled soil. Some entries mention that it can dig nearly 60 miles underground, which is a very dramatic number, but it fits Pokemon's habit of exaggerating to make creatures feel more impressive. Dugtrio is also sometimes described as being able to cause earthquakes or tremors by digging, which makes sense for a ground type that moves in groups of 3. In the original games, Diglett and Dugtrio were most famously encountered in Diglett's Cave, a tunnel that connects Route 2 and Route 11 inches Kanto. Diglett's Cave is a very memorable location because it's one of the first places where players can encounter a Pokémon that feels much faster and stronger than what they've been fighting on the routes. Diglett and Dugtrio appear frequently there, and because they are ground type, they are extremely useful for the Vermilion City Gym battle against Lieutenant Surge. That connection between Dugtrio and Lieutenant Surge is one of the reasons Dugtrio became iconic in early Pokémon playthroughs. Electric types have a major weakness. They can't hit ground types with electric moves at all, because ground is immune to electric. So bringing a Diglett or Dugtrio into that gym made the battle dramatically easier. Many players remember their first time using Diglett's Cave as the moment they discovered type advantages really matter. In Generation 1, Dugtrio's stats were built for speed and attack. It wasn't bulky, and it didn't have a lot of special power, but it could outspeed many opponents and hit them with strong physical attacks like Earthquake. In Generation 1, ground-type moves were generally physical, and Dugtrio had the attack stat to make use of them. Earthquake in particular has always been one of the strongest and most reliable ground-type moves, and Dugtrio is one of the Pokémon that benefits from it the most because it can often strike first. Another move Dugtrio is strongly associated with is Dig. Dig is a 2-turn ground-type move where the user burrows underground on the first turn and attacks on the second. It's not as strong as Earthquake, but it's often obtained earlier, and it fits Dugtrio's theme perfectly. In early Pokémon games, Dig was also a TM, meaning it could be taught to multiple Pokémon, but Dugtrio learning Dig naturally made it feel like the move was basically designed for it. One of the funny things about Dugtrio is that even though it's a ground type, it has always been surprisingly fragile. Many players assume a ground Pokémon would be sturdy, but Dugtrio is more like a glass cannon. It hits hard and moves fast, but it can't take many hits in return. That makes it useful for quick battles, but risky if the opponent survives and hits back. This fragility becomes more obvious in later generations, especially after the physical and special split introduced in Generation 4. Dugtrio's defensive stats didn't improve much relative to other Pokémon, so it remained a Pokémon that relies on speed and momentum. If Dugtrio is allowed to attack first and knock out the opponent, it looks great. If it gets hit by a strong move, it can faint quickly. Dugtrio's abilities also contributed to its reputation in competitive battling. One of its most important abilities is Arena Trap. Arena Trap prevents opposing Pokémon from switching out, except for flying types and Pokémon with Levitate or similar effects. This ability made Dugtrio extremely valuable in competitive play because it could trap and eliminate certain threats. Even if Dugtrio wasn't strong enough to beat everything, it could be used strategically to remove key Pokémon that a team struggled against. Arena Trap became so influential that it shaped entire battle strategies. Players could use Dugtrio as a kind of cleanup Pokémon, sending it in after a teammate weakened an opponent, trapping them, and finishing them off. This created a very specific kind of competitive role. Dugtrio wasn't always used to sweep teams, but to remove obstacles. It was a Pokémon designed for targeted eliminations. Because Arena Trap is so strong, it has also been controversial. In some competitive formats, Arena Trap has been restricted or banned because trapping abilities reduce the opponent's ability to respond strategically. This is a big deal because it means Dugtrio, despite looking like a simple joke Pokémon, has had real impact on serious competitive play. It's one of those cases where a Pokemon's design doesn't match how dangerous it can be strategically. Another ability Dugtrio has had is Sand Veil, which increases its evasion in a sandstorm. Sand Veil is less consistent than Arena Trap, but it fits Dugtrio's theme of being hard to hit and living in sandy environments. In some generations, Sand Veil has been seen as annoying because evasion-based abilities can make battles feel random, but it's still part of Dugtrio's history. In later generations, Dugtrio also gained a regional form, Alolan Dugtrio. Alolan Dugtrio is still a ground type, but it also gains the steel type, making it ground and steel. The biggest visual difference is that Alolan Dugtrio has long, flowing blonde hair, which became an instant meme when it was revealed. The hair looks like a wig or a collection of golden strands rising out of the ground. It's one of those Pokemon designs that people either love or find hilarious, and it gave Dugtrio a completely new personality. Alolan Dugtrio's typing also changes how it functions in battle. Ground, steel, gives it more resistances and a different set of weaknesses. It still keeps the general speed identity, but the steel typing makes it more defensive in some matchups. It's an interesting twist on a Pokemon that was originally extremely simple, and it shows how Pokemon uses regional forms to refresh older designs in unexpected ways. Despite Dugtrio's simple look, it has always had a very consistent identity in the Pokédex and gameplay. It's a Pokemon that digs, it moves fast underground, it can escape danger by vanishing into the earth, it often appears in caves and sandy areas. Even when its moves and abilities change, the core idea stays the same. Dugtrio is a tunnel creature, a sudden attacker, a Pokemon that exists mostly below the surface. Dugtrio's name is also one of the most obvious Pokemon names ever, and that's part of its charm. It's Dug because it digs, and Trio because there are 3 of them. That naming style is extremely Generation 1, where many Pokemon names were direct and descriptive. Dugtrio is a Pokemon that tells you what it is immediately, and it doesn't try to hide it. In terms of appearances across the series, Dugtrio has been a recurring Pokemon in many regions, often showing up in deserts, caves, and sandy routes. It's not always easy to catch early, but when it appears, it often serves the same purpose, a fast ground-type option. Ground types are always valuable because ground is one of the best offensive types in Pokemon, hitting electric, fire, poison, rock, and steel super effectively. Having a fast ground type like Dugtrio can make many battles easier. Dugtrio also has a unique relationship with the move Earthquake. Earthquake is one of the most widely distributed and useful moves in Pokemon, and Dugtrio is one of the Pokemon that uses it extremely well because it can outspeed opponents and deliver it quickly. Earthquake has been a staple move for decades, and Dugtrio is one of the Pokemon that benefits from it the most consistently. Another interesting detail is that Diglett and Dugtrio are sometimes described as being very sensitive to light. Diglett's Pokédex entries often mention that it stays underground because sunlight weakens it. Dugtrio, as the evolved form, is still associated with living underground, and it rarely appears fully above ground. That fits with the idea that these Pokemon are built for subterranean life, and that they only surface briefly. In the anime, Dugtrio has been portrayed as a Pokemon that can appear suddenly in large groups, often creating chaos by popping up everywhere. It's sometimes used for comedic moments, because the idea of multiple Dugtrio appearing at once can be visually funny, but it also reinforces the idea that Dugtrio can shape the ground around it and cause disruptions. In spin-off games, Dugtrio often appears as a common ground-type enemy or ally, again reflecting its role as a basic part of the world's ecosystem. It's not treated like a rare mythical creature. It's treated like a natural animal that exists in sandy places, which helps make Pokemon regions feel more alive. Not every Pokemon needs to be dramatic. Some just exist, and Dugtrio is one of those. One of the more quietly interesting things about Dugtrio is that it's a Pokemon that's easy to underestimate. Players might see it and think it's silly or weak, but then they get hit by a fast earthquake and realize it can be dangerous. That gap between appearance and performance is part of what makes Pokemon interesting. A creature that looks like three simple heads can still be a threat, depending on the mechanics around it. Over the years, Dugtrio has also become associated with specific strategies in competitive play, like trapping steel types or removing key threats. Even casual players sometimes remember Dugtrio as the Pokemon that saved them from Lieutenant Surge or helped them clear a difficult route. It's a Pokemon that often shows up when you need it, and then quietly fades into the background again once stronger options appear. That's the story of Dugtrio in a nutshell. It's simple, fast, and weird. It has been around since the very beginning, and it has managed to remain relevant not because it's flashy, but because it fills a role that is always useful. A fast ground type will always have a place somewhere in Pokemon. And Dugtrio, with its three blank faces staring out of the ground, has been doing that job since 1996. It's a Pokemon that looks like a joke, but plays like a tool. And in a world full of legendary dragons and cosmic gods, there's something quietly comforting about a Pokemon whose entire identity can be summed up as three moles that dig really fast. It's kind of hard to think about Pokemon as a series without Meowth showing up somewhere in the background, because Meowth has become one of those Pokemon that exists in multiple layers of the franchise at once. In the games, it's a fairly ordinary normal type cat Pokemon. In the anime, it's practically a main character. In the wider Pokemon world, it represents one of the earliest examples of a Pokemon that is both cute and slightly mischievous. The kind of creature you could imagine stealing food off a table and then acting innocent about it 5 seconds later. Meowth is a normal type Pokemon introduced in Generation 1. It evolves into Persian starting at level 28, which makes it another early game evolution line that players can fully complete without too much effort. Meowth's design is simple: a small cream-colored cat with a curled tail, whiskers, and a coin-like charm on its forehead. That coin is one of the most iconic parts of its design because it isn't just decoration. It's directly tied to Meowth's theme, behavior, and even some of its signature moves. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, Meowth was a version-exclusive Pokemon. Meowth was found in Pokemon Blue, while Pokemon Red had Mankey instead. This was part of the early design philosophy, where the two versions would each have a handful of unique Pokemon to encourage trading. So if you played Pokemon Red and wanted Meowth, you either had to trade with someone or wait until later games that made it more widely available. That small detail made Meowth feel slightly rarer to certain players, even though it wasn't meant to be rare in a story sense. Meowth's name is one of the most direct Pokemon names ever created. It's literally the sound a cat makes in English. Pokemon has always had some names that are based on sounds or very obvious references, and Meowth is one of the best examples. It's memorable, it's easy to say, and it instantly tells you what kind of Pokemon it is. Even if you had never played Pokemon before, seeing Meowth on screen makes it pretty clear you're dealing with a cat. The coin on Meowth's forehead is sometimes described as a charm or a symbol of luck. In Pokédex entries, Meowth is often said to be attracted to shiny objects, and the coin is tied to that behavior. Some entries mention that Meowth will pick up coins and bring them back to its nest, almost like a cat version of a magpie. It's one of those details that gives the Pokemon a personality beyond it's a cat. Meowth isn't just feline. It's greedy, curious, and a little bit sneaky. That greed theme becomes even more obvious when you look at Meowth's most famous move, Payday. Payday is a normal type move that causes coins to scatter after battle, giving the player extra money. It's one of the most unique moves in Pokémon because it directly affects the player's resources outside of battle. Meowth is the Pokémon most associated with Payday, and for many players, it becomes the reason they keep a Meowth around even if they don't plan to use it for serious battles. In the early Pokémon games, money mattered a lot more than it sometimes does in later generations. Healing items, Pokeballs, and TMs all cost money, and if you lost battles, you could lose a large chunk of your cash. Having a Meowth that could use Payday was a practical advantage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was useful. And in a boring Pokémon facts video, the idea of a Pokémon whose main value is making extra money is kind of perfect because it's not exciting, it's just helpful. Payday also fits Meowth's personality. A cat Pokémon that literally throws coins at its enemy and makes you richer is a strange concept, but it's also very memorable. It makes Meowth stand out among early normal types, because normal types often feel generic. They use Tackle, they use Scratch, they exist. But Meowth has a gimmick, and it's a gimmick that ties into the player's everyday experience of the game. Meowth's evolution, Persian, leans even more into the rich cat theme. Persian looks sleek and elegant, and it's often portrayed as a Pokémon owned by wealthy trainers or villains. In the anime and some games, Persian is associated with Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket. That connection gives Meowth's evolution line a certain reputation, even if in the games, it's just another Pokémon you can catch and train. In terms of stats, Meowth is not particularly powerful. It's relatively fast for an early game Pokémon, but it doesn't hit extremely hard, and it doesn't have much bulk. It's the kind of Pokémon that can be useful early, especially if you need a quick normal type, but it usually gets replaced by stronger options later. Persian, on the other hand, has historically been faster and stronger, and it can fill a decent role as a speedy attacker, but it's still not usually considered one of the strongest normal types overall. Meowth's typing as a normal type is also interesting because normal types in Pokémon are often treated as ordinary animals, but Meowth's personality makes it feel less ordinary. It's a cat, yes, but it's a cat with a coin, a money-making move, and a reputation for being a little criminal. It's like Pokémon took a regular house cat and added just enough weirdness to make it fit into a fantasy world. In the Pokédex, Meowth is often described as being nocturnal. It comes out at night to look for shiny objects. This fits real-world cats, which are often more active in the evening and at night. Pokémon tends to borrow a lot of animal behavior for its creature designs, and Meowth is a good example of that. It doesn't have a supernatural origin story. It's just a cat that likes shiny things. Another detail that shows up in some Pokédex entries is that Meowth's coin charm can sometimes become dull or scratched from being constantly used or carried around. That's a very small detail, but it makes the Pokémon feel more real, like it exists as an actual creature with physical wear and tear, not just a clean cartoon design. Meowth also has one of the most famous anime portrayals of any Pokémon. The Team Rocket Meowth is unique because it can speak human language, walk upright, and has a full personality like a character in a sitcom. This version of Meowth is so well known that for many casual fans, Meowth is not just a Pokémon, it's that Pokémon that talks. That is a level of recognition that most Pokémon never get. The anime explanation for why Meowth can talk is actually surprisingly emotional and weirdly detailed. It's said that Meowth taught itself to speak and walk like a human to impress a female Meowth. It's one of those storylines that is both silly and kind of sad, because it implies Meowth changed itself completely just to be accepted, and it still didn't work out the way it wanted. The result is that Team Rocket's Meowth became stuck between worlds, not fully belonging with humans or with other Meowth. Even though that storyline is anime only, it has influenced how people see Meowth as a Pokemon in general. It gives Meowth a kind of extra personality that doesn't exist in the games. Most Meowth in the games are just wild cats, but in the minds of fans, Meowth is often associated with cleverness, speech, and humor because of the anime. Meowth has also received regional variants in later generations, which is another sign of how important it is as a Pokemon concept. In Pokemon Alola, there is an Alolan Meowth that is a dark type instead of normal. This version is designed to look more like a fancy, spoiled cat with a smug expression and a more aristocratic vibe. It evolves into Alolan Persian, which has a rounder face and a different style than the original Persian. The lore behind Alolan Meowth is that it was brought to Alola by royalty or wealthy people, and it became pampered and prideful. This is a funny twist because it takes Meowth's existing rich coin cat theme and turns it into an actual personality trait. Alolan Meowth isn't just greedy, it's snobby. It's the kind of Pokemon that looks like it expects you to serve it. In Pokemon Galar, there is also a Galarian Meowth, which is a steel type. This version looks rougher and wilder, with shaggy fur and a more aggressive expression. It evolves into Berserker, a completely new evolution that looks like a Viking cat with a steel helmet vibe. This is another example of how flexible Meowth's core concept is. It can be adapted into a pampered aristocrat cat or a rugged warrior cat, and it still feels like Meowth. These regional forms also show how Pokemon uses familiar designs to explore new themes. Meowth is recognizable, so giving it a new form immediately catches attention. And because Meowth's personality is already tied to behavior and culture, it makes sense to give it variants that reflect different regions' styles. Meowth's move pool has always been fairly typical for a cat Pokemon. It learns Scratch, Bite, and other physical attacks. It can learn Fake Out in later generations, which fits the idea of a quick, sneaky cat slapping the opponent before they can react. It can also learn moves like Fury Swipes, which is basically the Pokemon equivalent of a cat flailing its claws repeatedly. Persian, the evolved form, often gets access to stronger moves and sometimes has a reputation for being fast and annoying. Persian has historically been able to use moves like Slash, which had a high critical hit rate in Generation 1. That's another classic boring but important mechanic detail. In Generation 1, critical hits were calculated differently, and fast Pokemon had a higher chance to land critical hits. Persian, being fast, could land critical hits more often than many other Pokemon, making it stronger than its raw stats might suggest. This is one of those early Pokemon quirks that gave certain Pokemon unexpected value. Persian wasn't the strongest attacker, but it could crit often, and crits ignored stat boosts and drops in Generation 1. That meant Persian could be a surprisingly reliable damage dealer in certain situations. Meowth also has a connection to the idea of city Pokemon. In Kanto, Meowth is commonly found on routes near towns, and it feels like the kind of Pokemon that could wander into a neighborhood looking for food. It's not a forest guardian or a mountain beast, it's a street cat Pokemon that helps make the Pokemon world feel more grounded. Not every Pokemon lives in a magical cave, some just live near people. Over time, Meowth has become a symbol of Pokemon's ability to create personality through small design choices. A coin on the forehead, a money move, a mischievous expression. That's all it takes. It's not complicated, but it works. And because it works, Meowth has stayed relevant through every generation, appearing in games, anime, merchandise, and spin offs. Even in modern Pokemon games with hundreds of creatures, Meowth still feels like it belongs. It's familiar, it's simple, it's useful in small ways, and it's connected to one of the most famous running gags in the anime. That combination makes it more memorable than many Pokemon that are technically stronger or rarer. So when you see Meowth, you're looking at a Pokemon that has managed to become iconic without ever being powerful in a legendary sense. It's not a god, it's not a dragon. It's not the face of the franchise like Pikachu. It's just a cat that likes shiny things and occasionally helps you pay for potions. And somehow, that has been enough to keep it around for nearly 30 years. Golduck is one of those Pokemon that feels like it should be simpler than it actually is, because at first glance, it looks like a duck that swims around and maybe uses water gun, and that's about it. But once you start paying attention to how Golduck is described across the games, it becomes clear that it's been carrying a slightly strange identity since Generation 1. It's a water-type Pokemon, yes, but it's also constantly described as having psychic-like abilities, strange headaches, and mysterious powers that never quite become fully explained. In a franchise full of dramatic legends, Golduck is quietly weird in a way that feels almost accidental, like it's been confusing people on purpose for decades. Golduck is a pure water-type Pokemon introduced in Generation 1. It evolves from Psyduck starting at level 33, which makes it a mid-game evolution in many playthroughs. Psyduck is one of the most recognizable early Pokemon because of its blank stare and its constant headache theme. Golduck takes that same concept and evolves it into something that looks much more capable and serious. It becomes taller, sleeker, and more athletic looking, with a streamlined body that resembles a strong swimmer rather than a confused little duck. Even the name Golduck is interesting in a small way, because it implies something golden, but the Pokemon itself is usually blue. Psyduck is yellow, which makes the duck part obvious, but the gold part has always made some players assume Golduck would be a golden duck Pokemon. In reality, Golduck is mostly blue, and its shiny form is not gold either. This has been a small point of confusion for a long time, and it's one of those harmless little quirks that becomes part of the Pokemon's identity. Golduck's design includes webbed hands and feet, a long beak, and a red gem-like marking on its forehead. That forehead marking is one of the most important parts of its look because it ties directly into the psychic powers idea that follows Golduck everywhere. In many Pokédex entries, Golduck is described as having a mysterious power that is linked to its forehead. Some entries say it can use telekinesis, others imply it can read minds or control objects. It's not officially a psychic type, but it constantly behaves like it could be. This leads into one of the oldest Pokemon debates that still shows up today. Why isn't Psyduck or Golduck a water, psychic type? The names Psyduck and Golduck sound like they should be psychic related, and the lore constantly points in that direction. Yet in Generation 1, they were pure water types, and that stayed true for Golduck across every generation. Psyduck eventually got a regional form in Legends. Arceus called Hisuian Psyduck. No, it didn't, so the typing remains unchanged, and the mystery stays alive. Part of the answer is likely that Pokemon's type system in Generation 1 wasn't always perfectly aligned with lore. Many Pokemon had weird type choices or strange move pools. Golduck being water only might have been a design decision based on balancing, or simply because the developers didn't want too many water, psychic Pokemon early on. But even if there's a development explanation, the result is that Golduck has always felt like a Pokemon that lives between categories. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, Golduck was not the most common Pokémon you'd run into. Psyduck could be found in certain watery areas, and then you would evolve it. Golduck itself was sometimes found in the wild later, depending on the game, but most players who used Golduck did so because they caught Psyduck and decided to train it, not because Golduck was a major story Pokémon. Golduck's stat spread has historically been fairly balanced, with decent speed and special attack, and enough bulk to survive typical playthrough battles. It isn't a glass cannon, but it also isn't a tank. It's the kind of Pokémon that feels reliable. It can take a hit, it can hit back, and it can learn a good variety of moves. That reliability is part of why Golduck has always been a decent water-type choice for casual teams, even if it isn't the absolute strongest option in any given generation. One of Golduck's strengths has always been its move pool. As a water type, it can learn Surf, which is one of the best water moves in the series for in-game use. Surf is strong, accurate, and also functions as an HM move in many generations, making it essential for progression. Golduck learning Surf is expected, but what makes it more interesting is that Golduck can also learn Ice Beam, Psychic, and other coverage moves depending on the generation. This gives it flexibility. It can hit grass types with ice moves, fight poison types with Psychic, and generally handle a wide range of opponents. In Generation 1, Psychic was an especially powerful type, and many water types couldn't easily access it. Golduck being able to learn Psychic through TMs gave it a strong tool. Even though it wasn't a Psychic type, it could still use Psychic attacks effectively because of its special stat. This made Golduck feel like a smart, water-type Pokémon, one that could do more than just spam Water Gun and hope for the best. Golduck's abilities also play into its identity. In later generations, it can have abilities like Damp, which prevents moves like Self-Destruct and Explosion from being used. Damp is not the most flashy ability, but it fits the idea of a water Pokémon preventing explosive reactions. It's useful in specific situations, especially in battles where wild Pokémon might explode to avoid being caught. Golduck can also have Cloud 9, an ability that ignores the effects of weather. This is actually a very interesting ability in competitive play, because weather conditions like rain and sun can dramatically change battle outcomes. Cloud 9 basically makes the battle treat weather as if it doesn't exist. That means Golduck can walk into a rain team and cancel the rain benefits, or step into a sun team and ignore the sun boosts. It's a quiet ability that doesn't look impressive on paper, but it can completely change how a battle feels. Cloud 9 also fits Golduck's mysterious identity in a subtle way. It's like Golduck is so calm and focused that it isn't affected by the environment. While other Pokémon react to weather, Golduck just keeps moving. It's a nice example of Pokémon abilities being more than just mechanics. Sometimes they hint at personality. In terms of lore, Golduck is often described as a strong swimmer that can move through water quickly and silently. Some Pokédex entries mention that it has webbed limbs that act like powerful paddles. Others describe it as being able to swim at great speeds. This fits the design because Golduck looks like it was built for swimming. It has a sleek body, long limbs, and a posture that suggests athletic movement. There's also a recurring theme in Golduck's entries about it being mistaken for a monster. In some games, it's described as being seen swimming at night, and people mistook it for a lake monster or sea creature. This is a fun detail because it ties Golduck into real-world folklore about mysterious creatures in lakes. It also fits the idea that Golduck is not a cute duck Pokémon. It's a strange, almost alien aquatic humanoid that could easily look terrifying if you saw it in the dark. Golduck's relationship with Psyduck is also important. Psyduck is portrayed as constantly suffering from headaches, and those headaches are linked to its psychic potential. When Psyduck's headache becomes intense, it can unleash powerful psychic energy without meaning to. Golduck, as the evolved form, is often portrayed as having more control. It still has psychic ability themes, but it uses them intentionally, not accidentally. That makes Golduck feel like Psyduck's grown-up form in a personality sense. Psyduck is confused and overwhelmed. Golduck is focused and capable. However, this is where the typing confusion becomes even more noticeable. If Golduck truly has controlled psychic power, why does it remain pure water type? Pokémon never fully answers, and that's part of why Golduck stays interesting. It's a water Pokémon with psychic lore, a creature that lives in two ideas at once. In the anime, Golduck has appeared multiple times, often as a strong water-type Pokémon used by trainers. It isn't usually a main character Pokémon, but it shows up enough to feel familiar. Psyduck, on the other hand, is extremely famous because of Misty's Psyduck in the early anime. Misty's Psyduck was comedic, constantly popping out of its Pokeball and acting clueless. That version of Psyduck made the entire evolution line more recognizable. Even if Golduck didn't get as much spotlight, people knew it existed because Psyduck was so memorable. In the games, Golduck has often been associated with mid-game water routes, lakes, and sometimes caves with water sections. It's not usually found in the earliest parts of a region, but it appears once the player has access to surf or reaches areas with larger bodies of water. That placement makes sense because Golduck is portrayed as a capable swimmer, not a small pond creature. Golduck's color scheme has also remained consistent across generations. It's primarily blue with red accents. The red gem on its forehead stands out, making it look like it has a focus point or a third eye concept. This is another reason it feels psychic, because forehead gems and markings are often used in fantasy to represent mental power. In Pokémon Go, Golduck has been part of the roster since the early days, evolving from Psyduck with Candy. It's not one of the strongest water types in the game, but it's common enough that many players have one. Pokémon Go also reinforces Golduck's identity as a mid-tier but reliable Pokémon, not rare, not legendary, just a steady part of the ecosystem. In terms of competitive battling across the main series, Golduck has had moments of relevance, especially in formats where Swift Swim mattered. Golduck can learn Swift Swim as an ability in some contexts. Actually, Golduck's main abilities are Damp and Cloud 9, but it can still be used in rain teams as a water attacker because it has access to good water moves. However, it usually competes with stronger water types that have better abilities for that role. So Golduck tends to sit in that category of Pokémon that is perfectly usable but rarely optimal. That's actually a big part of Golduck's boring facts charm. It's not the best at anything, it's not the worst at anything, it's just there, being a duck that swims well and maybe has psychic powers. It's the kind of Pokémon you might have on your team because you like it, not because you calculated that it's the strongest choice. Golduck also has a subtle identity as a Pokémon that bridges land and water. Many water types are clearly fish or sea creatures. Golduck is more like an amphibious animal, something that can walk and fight on land as easily as it swims. That makes it a useful water type for story playthroughs, because it doesn't feel out of place in normal battles. It can punch, kick, scratch, and also use surf. It feels like a water Pokémon that can function anywhere. One more interesting detail is that Golduck's Japanese name is Golduck as well, which is not always the case for Pokémon. Some Pokémon have completely different Japanese names. Golduck's name, being similar across languages, shows how early Pokémon sometimes used English-like names even in Japan, especially for simpler concepts. Golduck's place in the Pokédex is also notable. Psyduck is #54, and Golduck is #55, placing them early in the original list. They appear around other classic Kanto Pokemon like Growlithe and Mankey. This placement reinforces the idea that they are part of the core Kanto ecosystem. They're not rare creatures hidden in the endgame. They're regular wildlife Pokemon that you might run into during a journey. Over time, Golduck has remained consistent. It hasn't received a mega evolution, it hasn't gotten a major signature move, it hasn't been given a dramatic new form. It stayed mostly the same, and that consistency makes it feel like a stable piece of Pokemon history. Some Pokemon change a lot over the years. Golduck doesn't. It remains a blue water duck with a mysterious forehead gem and a reputation for psychic weirdness. And that's probably the most accurate summary of Golduck. It's simple, but not fully explained. It's ordinary, but slightly strange. It's a water Pokemon that constantly hints at being something more, and it has spent nearly 30 years existing in that quiet space between what it is and what it feels like it could have been. Poliwrath is one of those Pokemon that feels like it was designed to be dependable above all else, the kind of creature that doesn't need a dramatic backstory or a flashy gimmick because its whole identity is built around being solid and practical. It's a water and fighting type Pokemon, which already makes it stand out in Generation 1, because dual types that mixed something as common as water with something as aggressive as fighting weren't very common back then. Poliwrath has always had the vibe of a Pokemon that can do a job, do it well, and then quietly move on without needing anyone to clap for it. Poliwrath is the final evolution of the Poliwag line. The evolution chain begins with Poliwag, which evolves into Poliwhirl at level 25, and then Poliwhirl can evolve into Poliwrath using a Water Stone. That Water Stone evolution is an important detail because it means Poliwrath is one of the early examples of a branching evolution concept, even if the branch didn't exist in Generation 1. In Generation 1, Poliwhirl could only become Poliwrath, but later, in Generation 2, Poliwhirl gained a second option. It could evolve into Politoed using a King's Rock while trading. That change retroactively made Poliwrath part of one of Pokemon's most classic split evolution lines. Because Poliwrath is tied to a Water Stone evolution, it also shares some of the classic Stone evolution quirks. In early Pokemon games, evolving a Pokemon with a stone could sometimes prevent it from learning moves naturally by leveling up. That meant players often had to decide whether to evolve Poliwhirl as soon as possible to get Poliwrath's stronger stats, or wait longer so Poliwhirl could learn certain moves first. Over time, Pokemon improved how move learning works for stone evolutions, but in the original games, this was a real decision. Poliwrath's typing as water and fighting is one of its most defining features. Water types are usually associated with smooth movement, calm strength, and broad usefulness because water moves tend to be reliable and widely effective. Fighting types are usually associated with physical power, direct combat, and moves like Karate Chop, Submission, and later, Close Combat. Combining those two types creates a Pokemon that feels like a swimmer and a boxer at the same time, which is exactly what Poliwrath looks like. It has a sturdy body, muscular arms, and a stance that looks ready to fight. In Generation 1, Poliwrath's fighting typing mattered in a slightly strange way because fighting type moves were not as strong or as widely useful as they became later. In the original games, fighting was mainly used to hit normal types, which were extremely common. That made fighting valuable, but the move pool was limited and sometimes unreliable. Moves like Submission dealt recoil damage, and others had awkward mechanics. Poliwrath still benefited from having fighting coverage, but it wasn't as dominant as fighting types became in later generations. One of Poliwrath's most recognizable design features is the spiral pattern on its belly. This spiral is present on Poliwag and Poliwhirl as well, but it becomes more pronounced on Poliwrath because the Pokemon's body is larger and broader. The spiral is sometimes described as hypnotic in Pokedex entries, with the idea being that looking at the spiral can cause opponents to become dizzy or confused. This is a subtle but interesting detail, because it gives Poliwrath a slightly strange, almost psychological edge, even though it's not a psychic type. That spiral theme connects Poliwrath to moves like Hypnosis in the Poliwag line's history. Poliwag and Poliwhirl can learn Hypnosis in some games, and that fits the idea of the spiral being hypnotic. Poliwrath, however, tends to lean more into direct combat, which matches its fighting typing. Still, the spiral remains part of its identity, and it makes Poliwrath feel like a Pokemon that isn't purely physical. It has a little bit of weirdness built into it, the kind of weirdness that makes Pokemon designs memorable. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, Poliwrath could be obtained by catching Poliwag, training it, and then evolving it. Poliwag is found in water routes, often by fishing. Fishing itself is an interesting mechanic in early Pokemon because it requires a rod, and the quality of Pokemon you encounter depends on the rod you have. Poliwag is one of those Pokemon that many players might not see immediately unless they spend time fishing or exploring water areas thoroughly. Once you have Poliwrath, it becomes a fairly strong water-type option. Water types have always been useful in Pokemon because Surf is powerful, water has good matchups, and many regions include large water sections that make water Pokemon feel natural to have on a team. Poliwrath adds fighting coverage, which makes it even more versatile. It can hit rock types, ground types, and fire types with water moves, and then hit normal types and some other threats with fighting moves. Poliwrath's stats have generally been balanced with good attack and decent bulk. It isn't the fastest Pokemon, and it isn't the strongest attacker in the world, but it can take hits and hit back. That makes it the kind of Pokemon that feels reliable in long battles, especially in story playthroughs where you might not always have perfect type matchups. Poliwrath can often survive a mistake, which is valuable when you're not playing perfectly. In later generations, Poliwrath gained more tools that improved its identity as a tough fighter. It gained access to stronger fighting moves, better water moves, and more useful abilities. One of Poliwrath's standard abilities is Water Absorb, which heals it when it is hit by a water-type move. This is a very fitting ability for a water Pokemon, and it gives Poliwrath a strong defensive niche. If an opponent uses Surf or Hydro Pump, Poliwrath can switch in and heal instead of taking damage, which can completely change the flow of a battle. Poliwrath can also have Damp, which prevents explosions like Self-Destruct and Explosion. Damp is not as commonly useful as Water Absorb, but it can matter in specific situations, especially against Pokemon that use explosion tactics. It's another example of Poliwrath being a Pokemon that quietly stops problems rather than creating flashy moments. In some generations, Poliwrath can also have Swift, Swim as a hidden ability, which doubles its speed in rain. This ability is extremely useful in rain teams because it turns Poliwrath from a moderately fast Pokemon into a much faster threat. Rain teams are a major strategy in competitive play, and Swift Swim users are often central to them. Poliwrath having Swift Swim means it can function as both a bulky fighter and a fast attacker, depending on the situation. Poliwrath's move pool includes a mix of water and fighting attacks, as expected, but it also has access to moves that make it more interesting. It can learn Ice Punch in many generations, which gives it coverage against grass types, dragon types, and flying types. It can learn moves like Earthquake, which gives it additional physical coverage. It can also learn Belly Drum in some contexts, which can dramatically boost its attack at the cost of health, making it a potential sweeper if used correctly. In the context of a calm, boring fact sleep video, Poliwrath is the kind of Pokemon that is easy to talk about for a long time because it has a lot of small details rather than one huge dramatic moment. It's been in the series since the beginning. It has a branching evolution line. It has a unique typing for its generation. It has practical abilities. It has a move pool that can be shaped in many ways. It's the kind of Pokemon that doesn't need to be flashy because it's consistently useful. Poliwrath has also appeared in the anime in multiple roles, often as a strong water-type fighter. It isn't usually a main character Pokemon, but it fits naturally into the Pokemon world. A muscular, frog-like Pokemon that can swim and fight makes sense. It doesn't need an elaborate explanation. It's one of those designs that feels like it could exist in nature if Pokemon were real, which is part of why it works so well. One of the more interesting parts of Poliwrath's identity is how it compares to Politoed, the alternate evolution introduced later. Politoed is more whimsical and friendly looking, leaning into a happy frog theme. Poliwrath, on the other hand, leans into toughness and combat. This split makes the Poliwag line feel like a choice between two different life paths. One path becomes a fighter, the other becomes a cheerful amphibian leader. That kind of branching evolution concept is one of the reasons Pokemon evolution lines can feel meaningful. Poliwrath's typing also gives it specific strengths and weaknesses that shape how it feels in battle. Water. Fighting is strong offensively because it hits many types effectively. Defensively, Poliwrath has weaknesses to electric, grass, flying, psychic, and fairy in later generations. That sounds like a lot, but it also has resistances to fire, water, ice, steel, bug, dark, and rock, depending on the generation's type chart. This makes Poliwrath feel like a Pokemon that can handle many threats, but has some specific dangers it needs to watch out for. In Generation 1 specifically, Psychic types were extremely strong, and fighting types were weak against Psychic. Poliwrath being part fighting meant it had to be careful around Psychic attacks. This is another example of how a Pokemon's identity changes depending on the generation's mechanics. Poliwrath in Generation 1 was useful, but it lived in a world where Psychic was overpowered. In later generations, the balance changed, and Poliwrath became more comfortable in its role. Poliwrath's place in Pokemon history is also interesting because it's one of those Pokemon that many players recognize, but fewer players actively use. It's not as iconic as Gyarados or Lapras. It's not as flashy as Blastoise, but it's always been there, quietly available, quietly reliable. If you choose to use it, it will usually perform well. If you ignore it, you won't miss it. That kind of middle ground role is common in Pokemon, and Poliwrath represents it perfectly. In Pokemon Go, Poliwrath has been a fairly useful Pokemon in certain formats, especially in PvP leagues, where its typing and move pool give it good matchups. It can be bulky enough to survive multiple hits, and it can pressure opponents with fighting and water moves. This is another example of Poliwrath finding relevance in a different battle system because Pokemon Go's mechanics reward different traits than the main series. Poliwrath's overall vibe, if you had to summarize it, is sturdy water fighter. It doesn't need to be anything else. It's a frog-like Pokemon that can swim, punch, and keep going. It has been doing that job since Generation 1, and even with new Pokemon being introduced constantly, Poliwrath still feels like it belongs in the ecosystem of the Pokemon world. And maybe that's the quiet appeal of Poliwrath. It's not a Pokemon that demands attention. It's a Pokemon that shows up, does its work, and stays dependable. In a series full of dramatic, legendary battles and world-ending threats, Poliwrath is just a strong amphibian with a hypnotic spiral belly and a reliable set of moves. And sometimes, that's exactly what a Pokemon needs to be. Tentacruel feels like it has always been everywhere, even if you never actually put one on your team. It's a water and poison type Pokemon, and in the original games, it was one of the most common sights on the ocean routes, constantly appearing when you surfed across the sea. For many players, Tentacruel isn't remembered as a partner or a favorite, but as a frequent interruption, the jellyfish Pokemon that popped up again and again while you were just trying to get from one town to the next. Tentacruel evolves from Tentacool, starting at level 30. Tentacool is a small jellyfish-like Pokemon with two main tentacles, and Tentacruel is the larger, more intimidating evolved form with many more tentacles and a more defined body structure. In Generation 1, Tentacruel's design was fairly striking. It had a big red orb-like head, sharp-looking eyes, and a mass of tentacles that made it look like something you'd rather not bump into in the middle of the ocean. The name Tentacruel is a combination of tentacle and cruel, which fits the idea that it's not just a harmless jellyfish, it's meant to feel dangerous. Tentacool sounds a little more friendly and relaxed, while Tentacruel sounds like something that might actually cause problems. That naming difference is subtle, but it does a lot to shape how players perceive the evolution line. Typing-wise, Tentacruel is water and poison. That combination is not extremely common, but it makes sense for a jellyfish Pokemon because jellyfish are associated with venom. In battle terms, water and poison gives Tentacruel a set of resistances that can make it surprisingly durable. Water resists fire, water, ice, and steel, while poison resists grass, fighting, poison, bug, and fairy in later generations. This means Tentacruel can shrug off a lot of common attacks, especially in casual playthroughs. However, Tentacruel also has weaknesses. Electric and ground moves are major threats because water types are weak to electric and poison types are weak to ground. Psychic is also a weakness because poison is weak to psychic. These weaknesses are important because they shape how Tentacruel is used. It can be a good defensive Pokemon in many matchups, but if you leave it in against the wrong type, it can go down quickly. In the original Pokemon Red and Blue, Tentacruel's role was mostly defined by where it appeared. If you surf in Kanto, you will run into Tentacruel constantly, and sometimes Tentacruel as well. The ocean routes between towns like Fuchsia City, Cinnabar Island, and Seafoam Islands are full of Tentacruel encounters. This created a strong association between Tentacruel and the act of traveling over water. This also meant that Tentacruel became one of the Pokemon that players often leveled accidentally. If you surfed a lot and fought wild encounters rather than running, your team would gain experience, and Tentacruel could evolve into Tentacruel naturally if you caught one early. Some players ended up with a Tentacruel simply because it was there and it evolved quickly enough to become useful. Tentacruel's stats are actually better than many players expect. It has traditionally had high special defense and decent speed, which makes it a strong special wall in many contexts. In Generation 1, the special stat was a single combined stat for both special attack and special defense. So Tentacruel's special stat gave it both offensive and defensive power. That made it more dangerous than its random ocean encounter reputation might suggest. In later generations, after the split into special attack and special defense, Tentacruel continued to be known for its strong special defense. This means it can take special hits well, such as fire blasts, ice beams, or water attacks, depending on the matchup. It can also outspeed many slower Pokemon, allowing it to act before they do. Tentacruel's move pool is one of the reasons it has remained relevant. It learns water moves like Surf, Hydro Pump, and later Scald. It also learns poison moves like Sludge Bomb and Toxic. Toxic is especially important because Tentacruel can use its bulk and speed to poison opponents and then stall them out while they take damage over time. This is not the most exciting playstyle, but it is effective, and it fits Tentacruel's venomous sea creature identity perfectly. Tentacruel also has access to utility moves like Rapid Spin in later generations. Rapid Spin removes entry hazards like spikes, toxic spikes, and stealth rock from your side of the field. This gave Tentacruel a valuable role in competitive battles, because hazard removal is extremely important in many formats. Tentacruel could come in, take hits, remove hazards, and then either attack or spread poison. It became a classic support Pokémon. Its ability Liquid Ooze is another interesting detail. Liquid Ooze causes opponents to take damage if they try to drain Tentacruel's health with moves like Giga Drain or Leech Life. This is fitting because Tentacruel is described as having toxic fluids in its body. If something tries to suck its life force, it gets poisoned or hurt instead. It's a small mechanic detail that matches the Pokemon's theme nicely. Tentacruel can also have the ability Clear Body in some generations, which prevents its stats from being lowered by opponents. Clear Body makes Tentacruel harder to weaken, which again fits the idea of it being a tough, stable creature in the ocean. In later generations, it gained Rain Dish as a hidden ability, which heals it slightly each turn in rain. Rain Dish makes sense for a water type and gives it extra survivability in weather-based strategies. Tentacruel's Pokédex entries often describe it as being dangerous and sometimes aggressive. Many entries mention that it has 80 tentacles and that it can extend them to trap prey. Some entries say that its tentacles can stretch and wrap around enemies, and that it can sting with poison. These descriptions make Tentacruel sound like a true sea monster, even though in gameplay it is often just a random encounter. There's also a recurring theme of Tentacruel being able to control its tentacles with great precision. That makes it sound more intelligent than a simple jellyfish. It's portrayed as a creature that can actively hunt and attack, not just float around. This adds to its intimidating reputation, especially when you imagine encountering it in real life. In the anime, Tentacruel has one of its most famous appearances in an episode where a giant Tentacruel attacks a city. This episode became memorable because it showed Tentacruel as an enormous threat, towering over buildings and causing chaos. That portrayal stuck in people's minds and made Tentacruel feel more dangerous than it usually feels in the games. Even if you never watched that episode, you might have heard about it because it's one of those classic moments from early Pokémon anime history. Tentacruel's evolution line is also interesting because it is one of the earliest examples of a Pokémon that is clearly based on a real-world animal, but exaggerated into something more monstrous. Jellyfish are real, but Tentacruel turns the concept into a creature with sharp eyes, a large head, and a huge number of tentacles. It takes something familiar and makes it feel like a fantasy monster, which is one of Pokémon's core design philosophies. In terms of habitats, Tentacruel is typically found in oceans and seas, but in some games, it can also appear in deeper water areas or even certain caves with water. It is often associated with warm waters and coastal routes. This consistent habitat placement reinforces its identity as a marine Pokémon. It doesn't wander into forests or mountains. It stays where it belongs, in the water. Tentacruel also has an interesting relationship with the move Surf. Surf is often taught to a water-type Pokémon because it is both useful in battle and necessary for exploration. Tentacruel can learn Surf, and because it has decent special attack in many generations, it can use Surf effectively. This makes Tentacruel a practical HM user in story playthroughs. It might not be your favorite Pokemon, but it can do the job, and that makes it valuable. Tentacruel's poison typing also makes it immune to poisoning itself, which is a small but useful advantage. It can switch into toxic without being affected, and it can absorb toxic spikes in later generations, removing them from the field. This gives it another utility role in competitive play, making it a strong defensive Pokemon against certain strategies. One of the more boring but true facts about Tentacruel is that it has often been considered one of the best water poison types, simply because there aren't many competitors. Water, poison, is not a common combination, and Tentacruel has had that niche almost entirely to itself for a long time. That uniqueness gives it value. Even if it isn't flashy, it is one of the main representatives of its type combination. In later generations, Tentacruel has continued to appear, sometimes gaining access to new moves or slightly improved mechanics, but it has remained largely consistent. It hasn't received a mega evolution. It hasn't gotten a regional form. It hasn't been dramatically redesigned. It remains a classic Gen 1 jellyfish monster, and that consistency makes it feel like part of Pokemon's foundation. Tentacruel's role in a typical Pokemon journey is often that of a reliable water type that can also poison opponents. If you catch one, it can serve as your surf user and a defensive backbone. It can handle fire types, rock types, and ground types with water moves, and it can punish grass types with poison moves. It can also stall out opponents with toxic. It is not the most exciting strategy, but it is effective. And that's really the story of Tentacruel. It's a Pokemon that most people recognize, not because it's a star, but because it's everywhere. It is the ocean encounter Pokemon. It is the jellyfish that interrupts your travel. It is the creature that reminds you that surfing across water in Pokemon will never be completely peaceful. And despite that annoyance, it is also a surprisingly strong and useful Pokemon with a stat spread and move pool that has kept it relevant for decades. Tentacruel may not be glamorous, but it is one of the most consistent and practical water types in Pokemon history. It has been floating in the background since Generation 1, quietly poisoning things, quietly surviving special attacks, and quietly reminding players that the sea belongs to the jellyfish. Rapidash feels like it should be extremely common in the Pokemon world, because the idea of a flaming horse running across open fields is such a classic fantasy image. And yet, in many of the games, Rapidash ends up being slightly harder to obtain than you might expect, which makes it feel a little more special than a normal animal Pokemon. It's a fire-type Pokemon. It evolves from Ponyta, and it has always carried this mix of elegance and danger, like something beautiful that you still shouldn't touch. Rapidash was introduced in Generation 1 as a pure fire-type Pokemon. It evolves from Ponyta starting at level 40, which is relatively late compared to many other Gen 1 evolutions. That means if you catch a Ponyta early, you'll be carrying it around for quite a while before it becomes Rapidash. In a story playthrough, level 40 is often around the mid to late game, depending on how much you battle and how much you grind. So Rapidash can feel like a reward Pokemon, something you earn after sticking with Ponyta for a long time. Ponyta itself is a smaller, cuter fire horse Pokemon, and Rapidash is the grown-up version. It becomes taller, stronger, and more dramatic. Its mane and tail are made of fire, and its hooves look like they're built for speed. The design is simple but powerful. It's basically a unicorn-like horse without the horn, but with flames instead of hair. That's the entire concept, and it works because it's instantly understandable. Even if you've never played Pokemon before, you can look at Rapidash and understand what it is. Rapidash's name is another very direct Pokemon name. It's Rapid, meaning fast, and Dash, meaning to run quickly. The name basically tells you what the Pokémon is supposed to do. This fits Generation 1 naming conventions, where many Pokémon names were descriptive rather than abstract. Rapidash is a fast horse Pokémon, and its name makes that clear. In the Pokédex, Rapidash is often described as being extremely fast. Many entries mention that it can reach speeds of around 150 miles per hour. That number shows up repeatedly in different generations, and it has become one of Rapidash's defining lore facts. Pokémon loves to give speed numbers for fast Pokémon, and Rapidash is one of the most famous examples. 150 miles per hour is incredibly fast for a creature running on land, and it places Rapidash in the category of Pokémon that are almost like living vehicles. The Pokédex also often mentions that Rapidash's flames can burn anything that touches them. Some entries say that the flames will not burn people it trusts, which adds a softer side to Rapidash's personality. It implies that Rapidash can control its fire, or that its fire reacts to emotion. This is a common Pokémon trope. Dangerous Pokémon are often described as being gentle with people they trust. It's a way to make the Pokémon feel like a potential partner, rather than just a wild animal. Rapidash's flames are also sometimes described as being brighter and more intense when it is running at full speed. This creates a strong mental image, a Rapidash sprinting across a field, leaving a trail of firelight behind it like a moving torch. It's one of the reasons Rapidash feels like such a fantasy creature. It's not just a horse. It's a horse that looks like it's made of motion and heat. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, Rapidash was not available everywhere. Ponyta was found in certain locations, like Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island, which is a late-game area. That meant many players didn't even see Ponyta until later in the game, making Rapidash a Pokémon you might not have on your team unless you deliberately chose to catch and train it. This is interesting because Rapidash feels like it should be an early route Pokémon, but in Kanto, it's actually more of a late-game find. In later games, Ponyta became available earlier in some regions, which made Rapidash more accessible. But in Generation 1, it had that late arrival feeling. That also meant Rapidash often competed with other fire types, like Arcanine, Charizard, or even Moltres, depending on what the player chose. Fire types were relatively rare in Kanto compared to water types, so Rapidash still had value, but it wasn't always the first choice. Rapidash's stats have historically emphasized speed and attack. It is meant to be fast and hit reasonably hard with physical moves. In early generations, fire-type moves were often special, not physical, which created an awkward situation for Rapidash. It had good attack, but many fire moves used special attack. This meant Rapidash sometimes felt less powerful than it should, because it couldn't fully take advantage of its fire typing with its best stat. This changed after Generation 4 introduced the physical and special split, making certain fire moves physical. Moves like Flare Blitz became available, giving Rapidash a powerful physical fire move that matched its attack stat. This made Rapidash more effective and more in line with what players expected. A flaming horse should hit hard physically, and after the split, Rapidash could finally do that. Rapidash's move pool includes a mix of fire attacks and physical moves. It can learn moves like Fire Spin, Flamethrower, and later Flare Blitz. It can also learn normal type moves like Stomp and Take Down. Stomp is a particularly fitting move because it uses Rapidash's hooves and it can cause flinching. That fits the idea of a fast Pokémon stomping down before the opponent can react. Rapidash can also learn moves like Agility, which boosts its speed, although Rapidash is already fast. This is one of those boring but true move choices, Many fast Pokémon learn speed boosting moves even though they don't always need them. It's like the game is saying, yes, this Pokemon is fast, and if you want it to be even faster, you can do that. Another notable move Rapidash can learn is Bounce in some generations, which is a two-turn flying type move where the Pokemon leaps up and then crashes down. This is funny because you don't usually think of a horse Pokemon bouncing, but it does fit the idea of a powerful jump. It's also a move that can paralyze the opponent, adding utility. Rapidash has also been associated with the ability Flash Fire. Flash Fire makes the Pokemon immune to fire moves and boosts its own fire-type moves when hit by fire. This is an extremely fitting ability for a fire-type Pokemon. It's basically saying, fire doesn't hurt me, it makes me stronger. That makes Rapidash a good switch-in against fire attacks, which can be useful in battles where the opponent has fire coverage. Rapidash's other common ability is Run Away, which allows it to always flee from wild battles. Run Away is not useful in trainer battles, but it can be convenient in the overworld. It also fits the idea of a fast horse that can escape danger easily. However, Flash Fire is generally the more useful ability in most contexts. In later generations, Rapidash gained a regional form in Galar. Galarian Rapidash is a psychic and fairy-type Pokemon, and it looks completely different. Instead of flames, it has a pastel mane and a unicorn horn, leaning into a magical fantasy aesthetic. This version of Rapidash became extremely popular because it looks like a mythical unicorn, and it fits the whimsical style of the Galar region. Galarian Rapidash is one of those regional forms that shows how flexible Pokemon concepts can be. The original Rapidash is a flaming horse. The Galarian version is a magical unicorn. Both are based on the same core animal, but they represent completely different fantasy themes. The original is more intense and fiery. The Galarian version is dreamy and mystical. Interestingly, Galarian Rapidash also changes how people think about the original. Once you see the unicorn version, the original Rapidash can feel more grounded by comparison, even though it's literally on fire. That's a funny effect. The original is still fantasy, but the Galarian version is fantasy turned up to maximum. Rapidash's Pokédex entries often emphasize not just speed, but also pride. Some entries suggest Rapidash is difficult to tame and that it won't let just anyone ride it. This adds personality. Rapidash isn't just a tool, it's a creature with a strong will. It chooses who it respects. That kind of lore makes Rapidash feel like a wild stallion, not a domesticated horse. There's also a recurring theme of Rapidash being used as a mount in the Pokémon world. While the games don't always show this directly, the idea of riding a Rapidash makes sense. It's fast, it's strong, and it could carry a person easily. The fact that it's on fire complicates things, but Pokémon lore often suggests that trusted riders can ride it safely. Rapidash's presence in the anime reinforces this. Rapidash and Ponyta have appeared in episodes where they are shown running in herds, racing, or being cared for. One famous Ponyta episode involves a Ponyta that is afraid of people but learns to trust the protagonist. This kind of story fits Rapidash's lore about trust and flames not burning those it accepts. In competitive battling, Rapidash has never been a top-tier Pokemon, but it has had moments where it can be useful. Its speed allows it to outspeed many threats, and with physical fire moves like Flare Blitz, it can hit hard. It can also use coverage moves like Wild Charge to hit water types, or Drill Run to hit rock types and fire types. This gives it options. However, Rapidash often competes with other fire types that have better stats, better abilities, or more specialized roles. That means Rapidash tends to be more of a favorite pick than an optimal pick. People use it because they like it, because it looks cool, or because they want a fast fire-type horse on their team. And that's perfectly fine. Pokemon has always been about personal connection as much as strategy. In Pokemon Go, Rapidash is similarly a mid-tier fire type. It's not the strongest attacker, but it is usable. Many players have one because Ponyta is relatively common, and evolving it is easy. Rapidash also has a nice design that makes it popular for collection purposes. Another small but interesting detail is that Rapidash's shiny form is not dramatically different from its normal form in many games. It often changes slightly in color, but not enough to make it feel like a completely different Pokemon. This is one of those boring facts that matters to shiny hunters. Some shiny forms are extremely obvious and exciting. Rapidash's is more subtle. Rapidash's role in Pokemon history is also tied to the idea of fire types being rare. In Generation 1, fire types were not abundant. That meant any fire type you could get had value. Rapidash might not have been the strongest, but it was still part of a limited group. Over time, Pokemon introduced many more fire types, making Rapidash less unique in terms of typing, but it remained unique in terms of aesthetic. There are plenty of fire Pokemon, but not many that are literally flaming horses, and that's probably the simplest way to describe Rapidash. It is a flaming horse, it runs fast, it burns things, it is proud and difficult to tame. It has been part of Pokemon since the beginning, and even though it isn't always the most powerful choice, it remains one of the most visually iconic fire types in the entire franchise. In a world full of dragons, ghosts, and gods, Rapidash is just a horse with fire for hair, and somehow that is still one of the coolest ideas Pokemon ever had. Onix is one of the most recognizable Pokemon from the original generation, and it's also one of the most interesting examples of how a Pokemon's reputation can be much bigger than its actual strength. If you grew up with Pokemon, there's a good chance you remember Onix as a massive rock snake, the intimidating ace of Brock, the first gym leader in Kanto. Onix looks like a boss Pokemon. It looks like something that should be extremely powerful. But in actual gameplay, especially in the early generations, Onix is famous for being much weaker than its design suggests, and that contrast is a big part of why people still talk about it. Onix is a rock and ground type Pokemon introduced in Generation 1. It's a long chain of boulder segments shaped like a giant snake with a horn-like spike on its head. Its eyes look serious and almost angry, and its size is what immediately stands out. In the anime, Onix is portrayed as enormous, towering over trainers and smashing through the environment like a living landslide. That imagery made Onix feel terrifying to new fans, especially because it was associated with Brock, one of the first major obstacles in the games and the anime. Onix's name is based on onyx, which is a type of gemstone. That name fits perfectly because Onix looks like it's made of stone. It also has that simple, direct Generation 1 naming style. Onix is stone, and it is named after stone. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. In Pokemon Red and Blue, Onix is most famously used by Brock in the Pewter City Gym. Brock's Onix is level 14, and for many players, it's the first Pokemon that feels truly intimidating. At that early point in the game, your team might only be around level 10 to 12, and if you chose Charmander as your starter, Brock's rock types can feel like a wall. Onix's defense is high, and many early moves don't do much damage to it. That battle is one of the reasons Onix became iconic. It's tied to a moment of struggle and learning for many players. But once you actually catch an Onix yourself, you quickly learn something surprising. Onix has extremely low attack for a Pokemon that looks like it should crush things. It also has low HP. Its defense is high, but the rest of its stats are not impressive in early generations. This makes Onix one of the strangest Pokemon in terms of expectations. You see a massive rock snake and assume it's a powerhouse, but in practice, it's more of a defensive wall that doesn't hit very hard. This is especially noticeable in Generation 1, where Onix's base stats made it feel underwhelming compared to other rock types like Golem or Rhydon. Those Pokemon were slower, but they hit much harder. Onix, meanwhile, was fast for a rock type, but its low attack meant it couldn't take full advantage of its typing offensively. It was bulky in defense, but its low HP meant it still couldn't tank forever. So why did Onix have such low offensive stats? One explanation is that Onix was meant to be an early game boss Pokemon rather than a late game powerhouse. Brock's Onix was designed to be tough because of its defense and because players didn't have many options to deal with it. But if Onix had been given high attack as well, it might have been too strong for early players. The developers likely wanted it to feel intimidating without making it impossible. Another reason Onix became weaker in practice is that rock and ground typing comes with a lot of weaknesses. Water and grass moves hit it super effectively, and those are common types. Even if Onix has high defense, special attacks in Generation 1 could still hit hard, and water moves in particular were dangerous. This meant that Onix could be defeated quickly if the player had the right moves, even though it looked like a monster. Onix's move pool in early generations was also not amazing. It learned moves like Tackle, Screech, Bind, and Rock Throw. Rock Throw was a rock-type move, but it wasn't extremely powerful. Bind was annoying because it trapped the opponent for multiple turns, but it wasn't strong either. Onix could learn Dig, which fit its ground typing, but again, it wasn't the most powerful option compared to Earthquake. Earthquake is one of the strongest ground-type moves in Pokémon, and Onix can learn it through TM. That gives Onix a strong offensive option, but because Onix's attack is low, it doesn't use Earthquake as effectively as other ground types. It's one of those situations where the move is great, but the Pokémon doesn't fully take advantage of it. Onix's real strength has often been its speed relative to other rock types. Onix is faster than many bulky rock Pokémon, which means it can sometimes move first and set up strategies. In later generations, this became more important because Onix gained access to moves like Stealth Rock, which sets entry hazards on the opponent's side of the field. Stealth Rock is one of the most influential moves in competitive Pokémon, and Onix being able to use it gave it a niche. Onix also gained access to the move Rock Polish, which boosts its speed even further. Again, Onix doesn't necessarily become a huge offensive threat, but it can become a fast support Pokémon. It can set up hazards, disrupt opponents, and then switch out. This is a very different role than what most people imagine when they think of Onix, but it fits the reality of its stats. Onix's abilities also add to its identity. One of Onix's common abilities is Rockhead, which prevents recoil damage from moves that normally cause recoil. Rockhead is useful in some contexts, but Onix doesn't always use recoil moves. Another ability is Sturdy, which prevents Onix from being knocked out in one hit when it is at full HP. Sturdy is extremely fitting for a Rock Snake Pokémon. It basically means Onix can survive at least one big hit, which makes it more reliable as a defensive Pokémon. Sturdy became even more useful in later generations because it was updated to work like a built-in focus sash. This means Onix can often survive one attack no matter how strong it is, as long as it was at full health. This gave Onix more strategic value, especially for setting up hazards or using moves like Explosion in formats where it was allowed. Onix's hidden ability in some generations is Weak Armor, which lowers defense but boosts speed when hit by a physical move. Weak Armor is interesting because it plays into the idea of Onyx's rocky exterior being chipped away, making it lighter and faster. This is a very creative ability conceptually, even if it isn't always the most useful competitively. One of the biggest changes to Onyx's relevance came in Generation 2 when it gained an evolution, Steelix. Steelix evolves from Onyx when traded while holding a metal coat. Steelix is a steel and ground type Pokemon, and it is dramatically stronger and more durable than Onyx. This evolution felt like Pokemon finally acknowledging that Onyx needed an upgrade. Steelix takes Onyx's concept and turns it into what people always expected, a massive, powerful metal snake with incredible defense. Steelix's existence also changes how people see Onyx. Onyx becomes the pre-evolution, the younger version that hasn't fully grown into its true power. That makes Onyx's low stats feel more reasonable. It's not meant to be the final form powerhouse. It's the stage before the powerhouse. This is a common Pokemon pattern. A cool design that feels underwhelming becomes much better once it gains an evolution. Steelix also adds lore depth. If Onyx is made of rock, Steelix is made of iron. The idea is that Onyx's body becomes compressed and hardened underground over time, transforming into steel. This fits with the idea of Onyx living in tunnels and caves. It's like geological pressure turning rock into metal, a fantasy version of real-world processes. In the Pokédex, Onyx is described as a Pokémon that digs through the earth at high speeds. Many entries say it can burrow through rock and soil, creating tunnels. Some entries mention that it can travel underground at speeds of around 50 miles per hour. Again, Pokemon loves giving speed numbers, and Onyx gets one too. The idea of a giant rock snake moving underground like a drill is both intimidating and kind of funny when you imagine it. Onyx is also described as becoming harder as it grows older. Some entries mention that parts of its body can become magnetized, or that its body becomes polished and smooth. These details hint at the eventual Steelix evolution, even if the entries don't directly mention it in the early generations. Onyx's habitat is typically caves, mountains, and rocky areas. In Kanto, it can be found in places like Rock Tunnel and Victory Road. It's not extremely common, but it's present enough that players can catch one if they want. It often appears as a tough cave Pokemon, which fits its design. In the anime, Onyx is portrayed as extremely powerful compared to its game version. Brock's Onyx in the anime is a serious threat, and it takes creative solutions to defeat it. This portrayal made Onyx feel legendary in the minds of many fans, even though it is not a legendary Pokemon. The anime often exaggerates Pokemon power for storytelling, and Onyx benefited greatly from that. Another reason Onyx became iconic is because of how big it looks compared to other early Pokemon. In Generation 1, many Pokemon were small and cute. Onyx was huge and intimidating. That made it stand out. Even if its stats weren't amazing, its design created a strong emotional impression. Onyx also has one of the more memorable cries in the early games. The sound effects in Generation 1 were simple, but Onyx's cry felt heavy and mechanical, matching its rocky body. This is a small sensory detail, but it contributes to how players remember it. In Pokemon Go, Onyx is a Pokemon that many players encounter, especially near rocky biomes. It can evolve into Steelix, and Steelix has been useful in certain PvP formats because of its bulk. Onyx itself is not usually used in battle, but it is valued for evolution and for collecting. Onyx also has a shiny form that changes its color from gray to a greenish tone. This shiny form is fairly noticeable and has become popular among shiny hunters. It's one of those shinies that looks distinct without being too extreme. Over the years, Onyx has remained a symbol of early Pokemon challenge. It represents Brock's gym. It represents the moment you learned type matchups. It represents the idea of a Pokémon that looks stronger than it is, and it represents the idea that Pokémon designs can be iconic even if the stats don't match the hype. In a calm, boring facts context, Onix is perfect because it's a Pokémon that is famous for being famous. It is remembered more for its presence and appearance than for its actual performance. It's a rock snake that looks like a boss, acts like a boss in the anime, but in the games is often just a stepping stone to Steelix or a defensive support Pokemon. And that's Onix, a giant stone serpent that has been part of Pokemon since the beginning, quietly tunneling through caves, guarding Brock's gym, and reminding players that in Pokemon, looks can be deceiving. Cloyster is one of those Pokemon that feels like it belongs to a very specific category in Generation 1, the ocean creature that looks a little dangerous. It's a water and ice type Pokemon, and it evolves from Shelder using a water stone. Cloyster's design is simple in concept, but strangely intimidating in execution because it takes a small clam Pokemon and turns it into something that looks like a spiked, armored shell with a dark face hidden inside. It's not flashy, but it has a very clear identity. This is a Pokemon that protects itself by becoming a living fortress. Cloyster was introduced in Generation 1 as one of the earliest water, ice-type Pokemon, and that typing immediately makes it stand out. Water types are common, but water, ice is a much rarer combination, especially in the early generations. Ice is one of the most powerful offensive types in Pokemon because it hits dragon, flying, grass, and ground super effectively. That means Cloyster has access to a typing that gives it strong coverage against many important threats, even if ice comes with weaknesses of its own. Cloyster evolves from Shelder when exposed to a water stone. This is one of those evolution methods that feels slightly odd at first, because you might expect an ice-type Pokemon to evolve with something related to cold, like an ice stone. But in Generation 1, the ice stone didn't exist. Evolution stones were limited, and water stone was used for multiple aquatic evolutions. Cloyster being tied to the water stone makes sense in that context. It's still a sea creature, and the water stone is the ocean evolution stone. The fact that Cloyster evolves through a stone also means it shares a classic trait of stone evolutions. You can evolve it whenever you want, as long as you have the stone. This creates a decision point. Do you evolve Shelder immediately to get Cloyster's stronger stats, or do you wait so Shelder can learn more moves first? In some generations, Shelder learns certain moves that Cloyster might not learn naturally, making it beneficial to delay evolution. This is one of those small strategy choices that many casual players don't think about, but it exists in the background. Cloyster's design is one of the most memorable parts of it. Shelder is a small clam with a tongue sticking out. Cloyster, on the other hand, looks like a large purple shell covered in sharp spikes. Its face is dark, with eyes that look almost like they're floating in shadow. It doesn't look like a friendly sea creature. It looks like something you would step on at the beach and immediately regret. The spikes on Cloyster's shell are not just for style. Pokédex entries often describe Cloyster's shell as extremely hard, capable of withstanding explosions or heavy impacts. Some entries say that its shell is harder than diamond, which is a classic Pokémon exaggeration, but it reinforces the idea that Cloyster is one of the most physically durable Pokémon in its environment. The spikes are a natural defense mechanism. If something tries to bite or crush Cloyster, it's going to get stabbed. This defensive theme is reflected in Cloyster stats. Cloyster has traditionally had extremely high defense, making it one of the most physically bulky Pokémon in the series. Even in Generation 1, Cloyster was known for its strong defense. In later generations, this remained true. Cloyster can take physical hits very well, and that makes it useful in certain battles where physical attackers are common. However, Cloyster's special defense has historically been much lower, which creates a classic Pokémon imbalance. It can shrug off physical attacks, but it can be vulnerable to strong special moves like Thunderbolt, Psychic, or Fire Blast. This makes Cloyster a Pokémon that feels like a fortress from one angle, but surprisingly fragile from another. It's the kind of Pokémon that can survive a powerful earthquake but get knocked out by a strong electric attack. Cloyster's typing also contributes to this. Water, ice, means it is weak to electric, grass, fighting, and rock. It also has a weakness to steel in later generations. These weaknesses mean Cloyster has to be used carefully. Even though it has high defense, it can still be hit super effectively by common types. Electric, in particular, is a big problem because water types are naturally weak to it, and Cloyster doesn't have a way to resist it. Despite these weaknesses, Cloyster has always been valuable because of its move pool and its ability to function as both a defensive and offensive Pokémon, depending on how you build it. Cloyster can learn strong water moves like Surf and Hydro Pump. It can learn ice moves like Ice Beam. It can also learn moves like Spike Cannon, which fits its spiky shell theme. Spike Cannon is a multi-hit move that throws spikes at the opponent, which is very on-brand for Cloyster. In later generations, Cloyster became famous for one particular strategy, Shell Smash. Shell Smash is a move that sharply raises attack, special attack, and speed, but lowers defense and special defense. For Cloyster, Shell Smash is extremely powerful because it already has high defense, so it can afford the defense drop, and it benefits greatly from the offensive boosts. After using Shell Smash, Cloyster can become a fast and deadly attacker, which is a huge shift from its normal defensive shell identity. This strategy became even more dangerous because Cloyster also has access to the ability Skill Link. Skill Link makes multi-hit moves always hit the maximum number of times. This is important because Cloyster can learn moves like Icicle Spear and Rock Blast, which are multi-hit moves. Normally, these moves hit between 2 and 5 times randomly. With Skill Link, they always hit 5 times. This makes Cloyster incredibly consistent and powerful because 5 hits of Icicle Spear can break through substitutes, focus sashes, and deal massive damage. Skill Link Cloyster with Shell Smash is one of the most famous sweep strategies in competitive Pokémon. It turns Cloyster into a Pokémon that can potentially wipe out entire teams if it gets the chance to set up. This is interesting because Cloyster's design looks defensive, but its competitive identity became offensive. It's a Pokémon that looks like a wall, but in practice, it can become a missile launcher. In the original Generation 1 games, Cloyster didn't have Shell Smash or Skill Link, but it still had a reputation for being physically bulky and useful. It could use Clamp, a move that trapped the opponent for multiple turns in Generation 1 mechanics. Clamp was extremely annoying because it prevented the opponent from moving while they were trapped, similar to how Wrap worked. Cloyster's Clamp could be used to lock opponents down and slowly wear them out. This made Cloyster a frustrating Pokémon to fight in certain contexts. Clamp also fit Cloyster's theme. It's a clam-like Pokémon. It clamps down. That makes sense. Even if the mechanics were annoying, the concept was consistent. Cloyster's Pokédex entries often describe it as a Pokémon that only opens its shell when it attacks. This implies that Cloyster's face and inner body are usually protected. It stays closed for defense, then opens briefly to strike. This is a realistic animal behavior concept, because clams and oysters open and close their shells for protection. Pokémon took that real-world behavior and exaggerated it into a battle mechanic idea. Some entries also mention that Cloyster can shoot spikes from its shell. This is a more fantastical detail because real clams don't shoot spikes, but it fits Pokemon's style of turning real animals into combat creatures. Cloyster becomes not just an armored clam, but an armored clam with built-in weapons. In the anime, Cloyster has appeared as a strong water-type Pokemon used by trainers, but it hasn't had as much spotlight as some other Gen 1 Pokemon. Shellder, on the other hand, became famous because of its relationship with Slowpoke and Slowbro. In the anime and games, Shellder biting Slowpoke's tail is part of how Slowpoke evolves into Slowbro. This made Shellder more memorable, even if Cloyster itself didn't get the same level of fame. Cloyster's relationship to Shellder is also interesting because Shellder looks goofy and harmless, while Cloyster looks serious and intimidating. This is one of those evolution lines where the personality shifts dramatically. Shellder is silly, with a tongue sticking out. Cloyster is sharp and armored, with a dark face and spikes. It feels like Shellder grows up into something more dangerous. In Pokemon Go, Cloyster is known for being fairly bulky and sometimes useful in certain leagues. It can be obtained by evolving Shellder, which is common in water areas. Cloyster's ice typing can make it useful against dragon types and flying types, but it also has weaknesses that make it risky. Still, it is a Pokemon many players have because Shellder is easy to find. Cloyster's shiny form is also fairly noticeable. It changes from purple to a more orange or golden tone, depending on the game. This makes it one of the shinies that collectors enjoy because it looks distinct and different from the normal form. Another small but interesting detail is that Cloyster's Japanese name is Parshen, which is quite different from the English name. This is one of those Pokemon where the localization chose a completely different approach. Cloyster is a direct English pun on cloister, meaning enclosed or hidden away, which fits the idea of a shell that hides its body. It's actually a clever name because it connects the concept of being closed off with the creature's design. Cloyster's role in the original Kanto ecosystem is as a sea Pokemon found by surfing or fishing in certain areas. It isn't usually an early game Pokemon because you need access to water routes. This means Cloyster often appears later in a playthrough when players already have a team. That makes Cloyster more of an optional addition rather than a core team member. However, for players who want an ice type, Cloyster can be valuable. Ice types are relatively rare in Kanto, and having access to Ice Beam or Blizzard can be extremely useful, especially against dragon types like Lance's team in the Elite Four. Cloyster can provide that ice coverage while still being a water type, making it a practical choice. And that's Cloyster in a nutshell. It's a spiky, armored clam Pokemon that looks defensive, but can become extremely offensive in the right conditions. It has one of the highest defense stats in the series, a unique typing for its generation, and a competitive history that turned it into a dangerous sweeper. It is not the most beloved Pokemon, and it isn't the most iconic, but it has a clear identity and a surprising amount of depth once you look past the shell. In a world full of legendary Pokemon and dramatic storylines, Cloyster is simply a creature that closes itself off from danger, waits patiently, and then strikes when the moment is right.